I very much appreciate the thought and work that your page, Edward Flaherty Debunked, represents. I would like to confess to you that Mr. Flaherty's page, Federal Reserve Conspiracy Theories Debunked, is proving a great embarrassment to the university, and so we have had him take it down. Would you be so kind and gentlemanly as to do the same with your page, as we will do our best not to promote such falsehoods in the future. And I gladly condescended. I took the page down. It's been gone ever since. So what happens right about the same time there, and people don't understand this, but you know, I've been going through this plagiarism thing for, you know, for in a major way for 20 years, and it's absolutely completely out of control. And who are all these people who are advocating alternate solutions? Well, Jacques Jacarin, you know, he publishes this book, The Debt Virus. He writes me a long time before he published the book, early 90s, and corrected me on a spelling error, which I make very, very few of. And he wanted to know about my story of this, you know, which was Parable of Perfect Economy. Evidently he had some misunderstanding. It was actual history, and I don't know, I didn't really care for the tone of his, you know, initial communication, so I didn't go very deep with the guy, but the next thing you know, he's produced this debt virus, and the very first page of it is a blatant plagiarization of my Parable of Perfect Economy. Of course, he obfuscates it so that, you know, it's like in his own words. But this is a thing that never even transpired, and he's proving what a jerk he is in the very first page of his work. Well, you know, many years later, Steven Zarlinga comes along, and he's basically, you know, plagiarized the crap of my work too. Why do I say this, plagiarize? Well, you know, we've talked about Ellen Hodgson Brown, who's a particularly pathetic case. But it's as if all of a sudden, when ideas that I introduced to the world as a proof of inevitable failure and singular solution, when those ideas gained traction, all of a sudden everyone and their mother perfectly understood that there's an implicit obligation to maintain a vital circulation subject to interest, which inherently and irreversibly multiplies artificial indebtedness, which isn't even owed to an actual creditor, into terminal failure. And everyone understands that, and could call it something like a Ponzi scheme, as Ellen Hodgson Brown does. Well, to do that is something which is a blatant, indelible mark of pretension, because a true diligent thinker who resolves solution from the facts at hand, especially when they are so subtle as the things that I've been repeating for 40 years have proven to be so difficult for people to understand, and then to suddenly have actually even millions of people advocating the parts of these things that they think they understand, however entwined with their own mistakes of interpretation, as if they developed the thought, and you can't even find the original author any longer, and people like Ellen Hodgson Brown are advocating first one solution, and then another thing becomes solution, and then another thing, and then another thing yet. We don't have to dig very deep into each and every one of these cases, and I can see immediately, even if I weren't the author of, original architect of, this thesis of inevitable failure and singular solution, I can see that these people are as phony gets. Why? Stephen Zarlinga writes me. He wrote me after he published his book, The Lost Science of Money, notifying me that we're of like mind and asking me if I would help him promote his book. Well, here's my problem with that. I haven't met a person yet who actually figured out the actual fundamental cause of the issues that we have to solve, and therefore none of them could have had even the tools to develop actual solution. And here is this person suddenly out of nowhere pretending that he's resurrecting the lost science of money. So I write him about this. Well, he doesn't answer me back because he doesn't have any answers, and he realized he made a big mistake to write the guy that he had plagiarized in order to help him promote a book, especially when that book itself proves this man to be such a preposterous imposter. What did he advocate? He advocated what he called the Chicago Plan. The Chicago Plan reduced interest rates to something like 4 or 5%, which of course they've been reduced even below now, and we're still failing. And the reason is the very math that I gave when I was in high school in 1968, is that as interest multiplies the ever-escalating sum of debt into a terminal sum of debt, you have to reduce the interest rates. But because the debt is so great, it's grown at an ever-escalating rate of ever greater increments of periodic interest on an ever greater sum of debt. The escalation at the end of the cycle is phenomenal. So, even interest rates have to be reduced to near zero in the end of that, and so long yet as a single penny has to be reborrowed back into circulation, and far more of that is in fact reborrowed back into circulation at virtual zero so-called interest rates because of all the other rates that are floating around out there. You still suffer terminal failure. And so what has happened after he published his book, interest rates have been reduced below that. We're still in failure. Of course, the failure's only escalated. It requires more rescue efforts all the while because interest inherently multiplies debt at an ever-escalating rate. And so his own work disproves that he was ever the authority to speak up about this. And yet, we still consider this a proposition of solution. Ellen Hodgson Brown, she used to call this Pennsylvania currency the most brilliant banking model in our nation's history. Those are her exact words, as given to me by other people. People who know my work jammed her up about it. And eventually pointed me to an article at Op-Ed News where I challenged her myself. Now, why would a lawyer know about a special currency which funded government without taxation? Well, she never did. She never discovered it herself. It's a story that Mike Montagne made up and issues out of the mouth of Ben Franklin, Mike Montagne's words. You see, that's how phony these people are. Now, we can answer to all of them at once. What is the solution? I have said for 40 plus years, since 1968, going on 43 years now, I have said there is one and one only solution, and I've repeated this literally tens of thousands of times. There is one and one only integral solution for the categoric faults of pretended economy, which is also the solution of any potential categoric faults of any potential concept of economy. Why? Because there are two basic fundamental faults, those being number one, volumetric or dispositional, and I'll define that so we understand what I just said in a moment, and the other being this inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of artificial indebtedness, which we could just call cost, except that we need to understand it in the terms that I just expressed it, because those terms explicitly certify that the process is one of ever escalating and therefore inevitably terminal debt. If we don't understand that, we don't understand anything about interest. So our third possible categoric fault then may be any possible combination of these two powers. One, to corrupt volume and disposition. Three, to corrupt cost through interest, which is inherently terminal. And two, any combination of one and three. So those in effect perfectly, commensurably equate to what I've given for 40 years as the three categoric faults of this lie of economy. Explicitly, where interest is the means of imposing cost, or our third categoric fault then, the categoric faults of such a system as we suffer by imposition without assent, as this central banking systems which have been imposed upon the world then, is number one, inflation, deflation, and maldisposition of the circulation. And by maldisposition, I mean to refer to the fact that as interest inherently and irreversibly multiplies any sum of falsified indebtedness into a terminal sum of artificial indebtedness, all along the route, ever more of the circulation is dedicated to servicing the escalating sum of artificial debt versus sustaining the industry which is obligated to do so, which is what I call maldisposition, because it is terminal to industry. And why do I group it with inflation and deflation? Because it isn't just right to get the volume of the circulation equal forever, perpetually, to the remaining value of represented wealth under a purported economy, a lie of economy subject to interest, because you don't have a proportional disposition of the circulation which maintains the relative value of the currency and the remaining value of the wealth, because of a volume that's a whole volume that's equal to the remaining value of the wealth. Only some of that can be dedicated to conveying the wealth in commerce. So that's why those three things are grouped together in our first categoric faults of any purported economy subject to interest. Our second categoric fault is systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property. And our third categoric fault, again, is inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of artificial indebtedness by interest. Now, so somebody somewhere out there has actually proven an alternate solution? Absolutely not. It hasn't happened once, ever, yet, anywhere in the world. Believe me, I hear from all parts of the world. I know where this money is debt objection comes from. It comes from my parable of perfect economy, misunderstood by every amateur imposter who thinks they understand what's wrong with money now, that it can't be a debt. The truth is, the only possible existence for money is a debt, and we can prove this, and I've proven it many times, and we'll get to that later if we want. But, so, what are the solutions of each of these categoric faults? Well, the only solution for inflation, circulatory inflation, not price inflation or deflation, the only solution for circulatory inflation, deflation, and maldisposition is to maintain a circulation which is not only at all times equal